It started with a drawer. Not a big one. Not important, really. Just a slim side drawer in the writing desk I'd ignored for years, tucked under Bill's pens that didn't work, and old stamps I'd forgotten to use. I was reorganizing the house finally after Arthur passed. He died 6 months ago. Peacefully, they said. In his sleep. The kind of exit that sounded merciful, but felt incomplete. There were no dramatic last words. No whispered regrets. Just silence. And maybe that's what left me feeling so unfinished. So unspoken. I didn't cry at the funeral. People noticed. They didn't say anything, but I felt it in their glances, their hushed voices. I knew what they were thinking. She must be in shock. But I wasn't. I was empty. And that was far worse. So here I was, clearing out his things when I found it. A small brass key taped to the back of an old envelope labeled Claire's drawer. I stared at it for a long time, unsure if I felt sick or curious. My heart knew exactly what it unlocked. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my old writing desk, the one I hadn't touched in decades. There inside, wrapped in a linen handkerchief and yellowed with time, was my diary. Not just any diary, the one I'd started on April 4th, 1992. The first entry was written after a fight with Arthur about something so small I can't even remember it now. But I remember how he made me feel afterward, like I had made the whole thing up. That was the beginning. The beginning of doubt. The beginning of silence. I carried the diary upstairs like it might burn through my hands. I sat on the edge of my bed. The same bed Arthur and I had shared for most of our marriage. It didn't feel like mine then. But it does now. I opened the cover. The paper crackled. My handwriting was smaller back then. More careful. Like I was afraid of being overheard even by the page. April 4th, 1992. Today, he told me I exaggerated, that I make drama out of nothing, that I twist his words. I tried to explain I wasn't twisting, I was remembering, but he kept saying I was wrong, that I remembered it wrong. He smiled the whole time. Why does that smile scare me more than yelling ever would? I stopped reading, my eyes blurred, my chest tightened. It had started so early, so quietly. Back then I hadn't even called it manipulation. I didn't have the words for it. I thought maybe I was dramatic, emotional, oversensitive. Arthur made sure of that. Every time I tried to voice something that didn't align with his version, he'd tilt his head, half smile, and say things like, "That's not what I said, Claire. You're misremembering again, sweetheart. Why do you always need to make problems?" And because he didn't yell, because he never hit, I thought I was the one who was broken. So I started writing, not to be heard, but to survive. The next page was dated 2 weeks later, April 17th, 1992. He forgot my birthday, or said he did. But when Mara called to remind him, he surprised me with flowers. I should have been grateful. That's what he told me. See, I made it special after all. But why does it feel like I'm being managed? Mara. Her name pulled a different kind of ache from my chest. My best friend. My sister in everything but blood. Until she wasn't. But that came later. For now I closed the book, set it in my lap, and stared out the window. Arthur's gone. But he's not. He's in the walls. The echoes. The learned silences I still have to unlearn. But this diary is the key. To memory. To clarity. To finally being heard. I decided then and there that I wouldn't just read it. I'd reveal it. Piece by piece. Entry by entry. Let the world see what I lived through. How quiet the violence was. How deep the roots of manipulation run when planted with a smile. That night I began typing the entries. Every word. Even the ones I didn't want to remember. Even the ones that made me feel like a fool. Because I wasn't a fool. I was just convinced to believe I was. And now I want the record straight. The entry was dated April 4th, 1992, but the real memory started the night before. I had made meatloaf. His favorite. It wasn't anything fancy, just something familiar. Comforting. The kids were little then, Lily just 4, Jonah barely walking. I remember how Jonah kept throwing peas off his high chair tray and giggling like it was the world's best joke. Arthur sat at the head of the table as always, reading the newspaper between bites. That was his ritual. The news, he said, kept him sane. He barely looked up unless one of the kids made too much noise. "Can you get him to stop?" he asked without even turning his head. "It's distracting." I reached for Jonah's hand and tried to guide it back to his spoon, smiling like everything was fine. But inside, something bristled. The thing is, he'd forgotten. It was the anniversary of my father's death. 10 years to the day. I hadn't asked for flowers or attention. I hadn't even mentioned it that morning. I just thought after all these years maybe he'd remember. Maybe he'd ask how I was doing. But he didn't. I waited until after the dishes were done, the kids tucked in the house quiet. I found him in the den watching TV. "Do you know what today is?" I asked. He didn't even look away from the screen. "Thursday." I waited. Nothing. 10 years since my dad died," I said. Finally, he looked at me. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Then that smile. That infuriating smile. "Claire, why do you always do this?" "Do what?" "Make things about you. You're always keeping score. Always searching for some way to prove I'm a bad husband." I stood there stunned. He added, "You should have just told me this morning if it mattered so much." And I remember thinking, did I expect too much? Was it wrong to want him to remember on his own? That's when I went upstairs. I opened the drawer of my desk and started writing. He said I was keeping score, that I twist things. But it's not twisting to want to be seen. It's not twisting to want someone to remember who you are when you're not holding everything together. That was the first time I used the word twisting. It wouldn't be the last. Rereading that entry 30 years later, I felt like I was holding a picture of someone I used to be, blurry, uncertain, afraid to take up space. He was good at that. Arthur never shouted, never cursed, never raised a fist. He simply reframed everything. Like I was a painting he didn't like, so he shifted the frame until it looked the way he wanted. If I cried, I was sensitive. If I got quiet, I was withholding. If I spoke up, I was controlling. And every time I doubted myself, he was there to reassure me that he was right. It was gaslighting, though. I didn't know that term back then. I just thought I was going crazy. I flipped a few pages forward. April 14th, 1992. Today. Lily spilled milk on the rug. I got flustered. Arthur said I overreacted. "You're always so tense," he said. "You should be more like Mara, calm, relaxed." I wanted to scream. I'm not Mara, I'm tired, I'm trying. But there's never space to say that. There it was again, the comparison. He used Mara the way some people use scripture, selectively, manipulatively. She was our friend, my best friend once, and slowly over the years she became someone else, someone who echoed him, who understood him. She'd call and say, "Arthur's just worried about you, Claire." Or, "He's under a lot of pressure. Maybe you could ease up a bit." I started to believe she was right. Even my friend thought I was too much. So I stopped talking. Back in the present, I looked around the bedroom. The same space where I used to lie awake while Arthur slept peacefully beside me, the room full of his breath and my silence. The walls looked different now. Not because they'd changed, because I had this diary, these entries. They were evidence. Not just of what happened, but of what I felt. What I knew in my bones, even when no one validated it. And there's something terrifying about realizing your life was a slow erosion of self, and that the only person who noticed was the one you were too afraid to trust you. I sat back and closed the diary gently. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a fresh notebook, crisp clean, and began a new page. Today I remembered who I was before I was managed. I wrote it without flinching. I am not crazy. I am not dramatic. I am not the woman he shaped. I am the one I buried, and now I'm digging her back up. This wasn't about revenge. It was about witnessing. About creating a record no one could rewrite for me. About finally becoming the narrator of my own life. The hardest part to explain is this. He wasn't always cruel. There were roses, surprise weekends away, love notes tucked into my coat pocket, breakfasts in bed after I stayed up with a sick child all night, public compliments that made my friends say, "You're so lucky, Claire." That's what made it all so confusing, because it looked like love. But when I go back through the diary now, I see it clearly, the pattern. Arthur apologized beautifully, lavishly, and then he'd do it again and again, until the apology was just another part of the cycle, like a tide that washed over the damage without ever fixing the foundation. May 12, 1992, he yelled last night. I had asked him not to leave dirty clothes on the floor. I said it gently, I think. But he threw the shirt at the wall and said, "God, Claire, you're so uptight." Then he slammed the door. This morning he brought me flowers. Said he was stressed. Said I made him feel like a failure. He held me and cried. I believed him. Again. I reread that entry 3 times before I had to stop. I remembered that bouquet, red tulips. I'd placed them on the kitchen table and stared at them like a truce. But it wasn't peace. It was performance. His breakdowns came at just the right moments, right after he pushed me too far, right before I gathered enough nerve to say, "This isn't right." He cried when I was angry. He softened when I finally hardened. It was like he could smell the exact moment I might leave, and he knew how to reel me back in. And because I wanted to believe him, I stayed. One of the most vivid entries was from 1996, 4 years in. June 7, 1996, I told him I felt like a ghost in this house. That no one listened. That the kids only respected him, never me. He got quiet, then said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." Not, "I'm sorry I made you feel that way." Just sorry you do. As if my pain was inconvenient. I remember that dinner. He had made chicken marsala, lit candles, the works. After he served my plate, he raised a glass and said, "To my strong, beautiful wife." Then later that night, after I opened up, confessed how lost I felt, he shifted. "You're being overly sensitive again," he said. "You're twisting a good thing into something toxic." That night, I went to bed questioning whether I was the problem. Not him. Me. The diary became a mirror I didn't want to look into but needed to. It reflected all the places I made myself small to keep peace. It showed the way I turned on myself so he wouldn't have to. The pattern was always the same. I raised a concern. He got cold or cruel. I cried. He softened. I forgave. He repeated. And the scariest part, I began to confuse the apology for love. September 20th, 1998. I was sick. Feverish. Could barely move. Arthur brought me tea and rubbed my back. Then asked, "Did you ever apologize for the way you spoke to me last week?" I told him I didn't remember yelling. He said, "You don't have to raise your voice to hurt me, Claire." I apologized anyway, because he had made me tea. Reading that made my stomach twist. That's how manipulation works when it's wrapped in comfort. It doesn't look like control. It looks like devotion with strings attached. By the early 2000s, my diary entries became shorter, blunter, less hopeful. March 15, 2001, Mara said I seem distant. Maybe I am. It's easier not to talk. The fewer words I say, the fewer he can twist. June 9, 2002, he forgot Jonah's school project again. Said I should have reminded him. Told me it was my job to keep everything in order. When I asked if he felt any guilt, he said, "You always do this. Why ruin the day?" These weren't isolated incidents. They were the atmosphere I breathed. Back in the present, I closed the journal and looked around my kitchen now, clean, quiet, still. I ran my fingers over the table where those tulips once sat, where the tea was served, where apologies were offered like crumbs, just enough to keep me crawling forward. And I whispered something out loud. I'm not sorry anymore. Not for remembering, not for writing, not for finally reading it all again as it really was. That night, I opened a fresh page in my new notebook and wrote, "He taught me how to doubt myself with flowers in his hand. But the only thing blooming now is clarity." I used to believe Mara saved me. When Arthur was cold, Mara was warm. When I felt invisible, she noticed. When I needed to cry, her shoulder was there. She was my escape, or so I thought. But the further I read into my diary, the clearer it became. She wasn't standing beside me. She was standing slightly behind him. November 3rd, 1998. I told Mara that Arthur made me feel like I was disappearing, like I was always apologizing for things I didn't do. She sipped her wine and said, "Well, you are a bit intense sometimes. You just care so much, Claire." I laughed at the time, but that word intense stuck with me like a thorn. Back then, I brushed it off. I needed her to be on my side. Mara and I had met in a women's book club. She was sharp, funny, a little intimidating in her confidence, but she took to me instantly, or maybe she took to Arthur. The two of them had a natural ease I didn't share. At first, it didn't bother me. Until the day I came home early and found her sitting on the back porch with Arthur laughing about something I was clearly not a part of. They weren't touching, they weren't whispering, but the air felt like a secret. February 19th, 2003, Mara said something odd today. She said, "Arthur just wants you to be happy, but you resist it. What does that even mean? How can I resist happiness?" I think she thinks I'm the problem too, that I make it hard to love me. That's when the cracks began. She started finishing his sentences when we were all together, echoing his concerns about my mood swings, suggesting I should try yoga, or read this article on emotional regulation. Always with a smile, always like a friend. But every comment left a bruise. I remember one night Arthur and I had fought. He said I was being controlling about the family vacation, that I always needed everything my way. I cried in the bathroom while brushing my teeth. I didn't yell, I didn't fight back. I just cried quietly. The next morning, Mara showed up with a smoothie and said, "You and Arthur really need a reset. You're both so stubborn." But I hadn't raised my voice once. All I had done was ask to be considered. May 12th, 2005, Arthur left a note on the fridge. "Don't forget to pick up my dry cleaning." Mara reminded me, but I know how you get distracted. Mara reminded him. Not me. Mara knew about his schedule better than I did. That day, I began wondering if I had ever been the center of my own life, or if I had always existed on the edge of Arthur's narrative, propped up by Mara's gentle redirections. One entry stood out painfully. August 7, 2007, Jonah had a fever. I stayed up all night with him. Arthur slept through it. The next day, Mara called to check on Jonah. Arthur had told her he'd been up all night with him. She said he's such a great dad. I didn't correct her. I didn't even know how. That's what manipulation does. It makes you small, then convinces you're the only one who thinks so. Even your friends begin to reflect a version of you that you don't recognize, but no one questions it because they're seeing what he allowed them to see. And Mara, she was a willing mirror. After Arthur's funeral, Mara came over with a casserole. Of course she did. We sat in the same kitchen we'd shared so many cups of coffee in. But everything had changed. She hugged me longer than I wanted. Then she said, "I hope you can find peace now. Arthur really tried, you know." I looked at her and realized she still didn't see it. Or maybe she never wanted to. Maybe she needed to believe in the Arthur she imagined, because if he was manipulative, then she had been complicit. And who wants to admit they helped erase someone? Back in the present, I read the entries with growing clarity. It wasn't just Arthur. It was Mara. It was everyone who accepted his version of me because it was easier than questioning him. But now there were no more filters. Just the words I wrote, raw, sometimes frantic, always honest. And reading them gave me a kind of strength I hadn't felt in years. I closed the diary and walked to the kitchen. The light through the window was soft golden, the kind of light that makes everything seem clean. I poured a cup of tea, sat at the table, and wrote in my new notebook. She wasn't just my friend. She was his echo, and I was the silence between them. But not anymore. There was a time I thought I was losing my mind. I wasn't exaggerating. I truly believed something was wrong with me. Memory lapses, emotional overreactions, misinterpretations of conversations I was sure had happened one way, until Arthur told me they hadn't. "Claire, that's not what I said. You're remembering it wrong again." "God, do you hear yourself sometimes?" He said it with a kind of calm authority that made me second-guess reality. It wasn't angry, it was factual, like he was a professor correcting a student. The more I challenged it, the more exhausted I became. Eventually, I stopped fighting back and started writing everything down. Dates, times, Verbatim phrases. That's how the diary really began, not as a place for feelings, but as evidence. January 16th, 2006. We argued about the tax forms. I told him we'd agreed I would file them. He said I never said that. I even reminded him of the envelope I placed on the desk. He said I was confused, that he'd asked me to just double-check the receipts. But I know what I heard. I know I'm right. Why do I feel like I'm unraveling? That entry punched me in the chest when I read it again, because by then I was unraveling. But not because I was unstable, because I was being dismantled one gaslight at a time. There was one moment I'll never forget. I was chopping carrots in the kitchen. The kids were in high school by then. Arthur came in and kissed me on the cheek. He said, "Did you move my appointment with the accountant?" I said, "No, you said you wanted to move it to next week." He paused, smiled gently. "No, sweetheart. I said I wanted to keep it this week. You always hear things backwards." I remember the way I gripped the knife harder. My stomach sank. Not because I thought he was lying, but because I believed him. That's what terrified me most. I began distrusting my own ears, my own memory, my own voice. March 2nd, 2008. I wrote down what he said word for word this time. "I don't want to invite your cousin to the dinner party." He said it clearly. I even repeated it back. But today, when she asked why she wasn't invited, he said, "Claire didn't want you there." And when I confronted him, he said, "I would never say that." That entry was followed by a scribbled sentence. Am I losing it? Reading it now makes my hands shake. Because I wasn't. He just made sure I thought I was. At one point, I considered seeing a neurologist. I was forgetting words, losing track of conversations, feeling foggy and slow. But what I now understand is this mental fog isn't always a symptom of illness. Sometimes it's the result of constant invalidation. Being told you're wrong, crazy, unstable over and over rewires your brain. You begin to police your own memory. You doubt everything. And when that happens, you become easy to control. There was a year, I think it was 2010, when I started writing sticky notes for myself, not to remind me of tasks, but to remind me of truth. He said it. I heard it. You are not confused. Don't apologize for what you didn't do. I'd tuck them into drawers, under my pillow, in my journal. Tiny lifelines trying to keep me tethered to myself. August 15th, 2012. He found one of my notes. The one that said, "You're not crazy." He laughed. Said, "Claire, if you have to write that down, maybe you are." That day broke something in me. But it also ignited something. Because when I wrote the diary entry that night, I didn't ask if I was crazy. I wrote, "He needs me to feel insane so I won't question him. I see it now. I'm not broken. He is." Back in the present, I held the diary against my chest and whispered aloud, "I remember." And I was right to remember. I opened my new notebook and wrote one sentence in bold underlined. "Gaslighting is violence with a smile." Then smaller underneath, "And I survived it with pen and paper." There's a moment you stop being a person and start being a role. I don't know exactly when it happened to me. Maybe it was when the kids stopped calling me mommy and started calling me mom, not with affection, but with expectation. Or maybe it was when Arthur stopped saying my name altogether and started calling from the other room. "Where's the receipt? Did you call the plumber? Can you make sure Lily's project is done?" He never said Claire. And somehow, I stopped saying it too. October 2009. No one said my name today. Not once. The kids needed rides. Arthur needed dinner. The house needed cleaning. I was useful. Present. Needed. But not seen. That's what struck me as I reread that entry. I had become invisible in plain sight. I was mom. I was wife. I was could you. But I wasn't Claire anymore. Not the Claire who used to sing off-key in the car. Not the Claire who read poetry aloud in cafes. Not the Claire who used to journal because she had something to say, not just something to survive. That Claire had been slowly, meticulously erased. The diary didn't lie. Entry after entry, it showed how my voice was replaced by function. My name by obligation. May 2011, Arthur said, "Don't embarrass me in front of the partners tonight." I hadn't even spoken yet. I wore the dress he liked. I stayed quiet. Smiled. I was a wife, not a person. July 3rd, 2012, Jonah said I was too emotional again. I was upset because he forgot our lunch date. He rolled his eyes and said, "Dad's right. You always take things too personally." I laughed it off, but I cried in the pantry later. Alone. Even my children, my heart had learned to treat me as a role, not a woman. But how could they not? They were raised in a house where I was constantly corrected, constantly softened, constantly redirected. Arthur had rewritten me, and they grew up reading that version. There was a time when I tried to push back, to remind them. I took a pottery class one year. I remember coming home with clay under my nails, smiling like I hadn't in months. Arthur looked at my hands and said, "Did you even start dinner?" That smile faded quickly. October 14, 2013, he didn't ask how the class went. He didn't look at what I made. He only noticed that dinner wasn't ready. I scrubbed the clay from my hands so fast I bled. I didn't go back to class. It's not that Arthur forbid me from being myself. He just made it easier not to be. It was less conflict, less guilt, less effort to just shrink. So I did. Like a flower closing in the dark. And somewhere along the line, I forgot what I used to bloom for. One diary entry stood out like a scream. February 21, 2015. I miss hearing my name. I miss someone asking what I think, not what I can do. I miss being Claire. Is she still in here somewhere? Reading that broke me. Because yes, she was. She had been whispering through every line I wrote. Now in the present, I stood in front of the hallway mirror. I looked at myself, really looked. "Claire," I whispered aloud. It felt foreign, but also like coming home. I touched my face, my lines, my eyes, my gray streaks, and I said again louder, "Claire." The woman in the mirror didn't smile, but she didn't flinch either. She just nodded. That night, I opened my new notebook and wrote, "My name is Claire, not mom, not wife, not too sensitive. Claire." And she's not gone. She's been waiting. I remember the exact day I stopped speaking. Not completely, I still gave directions, still asked if the kids had eaten, still thanked the grocery clerk. But I stopped speaking in the way that meant something. In the way that risked being known. It wasn't a decision. It was a retreat. Like a dog curling up after being kicked too many times, not violently, but consistently, repeatedly, quietly. April 3rd, 2016. He said I had ruined dinner again, that I never listen, that I hear what I want to hear. I opened my mouth to respond, to say I tried, but no sound came out. Not because I was scared, but because I already knew how the conversation would end. That was it. That was the day. We had guests over that night, Arthur's work friends. I'd made lemon chicken and herb potatoes, set the table with the linen napkins, lit the candles he liked. Everything was fine. Until it wasn't. Arthur tasted the chicken, set down his fork, and said in front of everyone, "Did you change the recipe? It's a little dry." Just that. No anger, no bite. But something in me fractured. Because I had stood in that kitchen for hours, following the steps exactly. Checking, rechecking, measuring, trying to make everything perfect. And instead of thanks or even silence, he offered correction. Again. The table went quiet. I laughed softly, said maybe I overcooked it a bit. Inside, I was screaming. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood by the sink washing the dishes. Arthur came up behind me, said, "You know you embarrassed me a little tonight. That joke about the chicken. You made it sound like I was rude." I stared at the soap bubbles, and something inside me turned off like a switch flipped. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't explain. I just said, "Okay," not because I agreed, but because I was done. From that day forward, I became a woman of nods, of and sure, and I don't remember. I let Arthur narrate our life. Let him tell his version. Let him be right. Because no matter what I said, the outcome was the same. So I chose peace, or what I thought was peace. May 19, 2017. Lily asked me why I don't speak up more when Dad interrupts me. I said it doesn't matter. She said, "But it does to me." I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't know how to explain that silence became safer than honesty. Lily was the first to notice. But even she didn't understand. Because she hadn't been there for the years it took to reach that kind of stillness. She hadn't watched her words turned inside out her intentions, recast her truths, minimized until they became inconveniences. To speak meant to risk being invalidated again. So I stopped. But the diary didn't stop. It became my only voice. October 22nd, 2018. He said we'd talked about it, that I had agreed to host Thanksgiving. I don't remember agreeing, but maybe I did. Or maybe I just nodded, and he translated that into yes. I want to scream, but instead I write. This is the only place I'm still real. There were pages like that for years. Terse, repetitive, almost coded. Like messages scratched on a wall by someone trying not to forget they ever existed. It wasn't just Arthur anymore. It was everyone. Friends would talk over me. Jonah would answer for me. Even strangers in line at the bank and the doctor's office seemed to sense it. I was a woman who wouldn't push back. Because that's what I had become. Not by nature, but by design. In the present, I sat with those old entries spread around me like puzzle pieces. And I whispered, no more. Not rage, not even regret. Just a decision. I opened my new notebook and wrote, silence was once my protection. Now my voice will be my weapon. Even if it trembles, even if it shakes, I will speak. Arthur always had a way of making manipulation feel like generosity. So when he suggested therapy, I was hopeful, relieved even. I think we should talk to someone, he said one evening, not long after another quiet dinner turned into another louder silence. I just want us to be okay, Claire. And the way he said us, it felt like a lifeline. What I didn't realize then, what I only see clearly now, is that he wasn't offering to fix the marriage. He was offering to fix me. January 5th, 2019. We had our first therapy session. Arthur picked the therapist someone his colleague's wife recommended. Dr. Alan Rice. Neutral office calming voice. Warm tea. But after 10 minutes, I noticed something. Dr. Rice kept turning to Arthur after every one of my sentences. As if asking, is that how it happened? I wrote that entry sitting in the car after our appointment, hands shaking around the steering wheel. It was déjà vu, except now my reality was being doubted professionally. Dr. Rice didn't yell. He didn't side openly. But he said things like, Claire, do you think Arthur was intentionally trying to hurt you? Or, let's explore why you're feeling that way. Has this happened before in your past? Every time I spoke about a moment that hurt me, the conversation shifted toward my perception, my patterns, my sensitivities. And Arthur, he played his role perfectly. Soft-spoken, patient, rational. I just want to understand her better, he'd say, while I clenched my fists in my lap, trying not to scream. January 19th, 2019, Arthur told Dr. Rice I was emotionally unpredictable. Said I withdraw when things get hard. Said he feels responsible for stabilizing the home. Dr. Rice nodded thoughtfully. I stared at the carpet, wondering if anyone could hear me at all. That session ended with a suggestion that I should attend a few solo appointments to work through my reactivity. Arthur. He didn't need solo time. He was grounded, secure. The implication was clear. And yet, I kept going. Because something in me still believed that maybe if I worked hard enough, if I was vulnerable enough, someone would finally see the truth. Instead, I began censoring myself in sessions. I filtered what I said. I smiled when I didn't want to. I said, that makes sense, when it didn't. It was Arthur's world again. Just with copays. February 9th, 2019, I cried in session today. Told Dr. Rice I sometimes feel erased. That my thoughts don't matter unless they benefit Arthur. He said, that sounds painful, but do you think that belief might come from your own inner critic? Arthur looked relieved. I felt like I had betrayed myself by speaking. That's when I stopped opening up. I went to therapy, like I went to dinner parties, dressed appropriately, smiled politely, contributed when expected, and left empty. Then one day Arthur canceled a session, said work got in the way. Dr. Rice offered me the time slot, and that's when something changed. It was the first time I was in that room alone, not as a wife, but as Claire. I told Dr. Rice nothing at first. Just sat, looked at the bookshelves, counted the hums of the air purifier, and then I asked him one question. Do you believe that someone can be both charming and abusive? His expression didn't change, but his answer was the first honest one I ever heard from him. Yes, especially when the charm masks the abuse. It didn't fix everything. It didn't even fix me. But it cracked something open. Because for once, someone didn't rush to make me the problem. Back in the present, I reread those early therapy entries and I didn't cry. I felt grateful. Grateful that I wrote it all down. That even when no one saw me, I did. And that slowly I was becoming someone who didn't need anyone else to validate what she knew was true. I opened my new notebook and wrote, "He tried to choose the therapist, but I chose to finally tell the truth." And this time, no one interrupted me. There's a particular kind of heartbreak that comes not from betrayal, but from recognition. It was in Lily's face, her voice, the way she paused before speaking, like choosing which version of me she wanted to confront. She had Arthur's tone, not his words, but his cadence. And when she finally looked at me across that cafe table, I realized she saw me the way he taught her to. October 12th, 2020, we met for lunch. She seemed distracted. Said she'd been talking to Dad more lately, that he just makes more sense. I asked what that meant. She said, "Sometimes, Mom, it's exhausting trying to figure out how to be around you." I didn't cry. I just nodded. And that scared me most of all. That conversation had begun normally. She was 27 then, confident, polished, articulate in ways I never taught her, and in some I wish I had. She spoke about her job, her apartment, her new partner. I smiled and nodded, trying to catch up with her life. Then, as if changing the channel, she said, "Mom, have you ever thought about seeing someone for yourself? Like, really seeing someone?" I blinked. "I mean therapy," she clarified. "To deal with, you know, your intensity." There it was again, that word. Intensity, Arthur's favorite. You overanalyze everything. You dwell. You always make things so complicated. He'd said those things for years, and now, so did she. But it wasn't what she said that cut me. It was the ease with which she said it, like it was fact. Like my entire personality had been quietly filed into a folder labeled difficult. October 13th, 2020. She said I weaponize guilt. That I make people feel bad without even trying. That when she tells me something hard, she ends up feeling like she has to comfort me. I asked if that's how she's always felt. She said it's how Dad explained it once, and it just fits. That entry hurt to read, because she was right in a way. There were times I leaned on her too much, times I looked to her for validation I should have found in myself. Times I was too fragile, too raw, too scared to shield her from my pain. But I was never trying to manipulate her. I was just surviving. Still, it didn't matter. She'd been raised in the same house that erased me. And now she had internalized the script. Arthur didn't have to turn Lily against me. He just had to let her observe. My silence, his calm, my spirals, his explanations. Over time, she decided which story was easier to believe. And it wasn't mine. October 18th, 2020. I reread my old entries about her. Her first steps. Her first heartbreak. The time she threw her arms around me in the rain and said I was her favorite person on earth. I wonder if she remembers those things too, or if she's replaced them with Dad's version of who I am. In the present, I didn't feel anger toward her, only ache, because children grow up watching who gets to be right and who gets corrected. They learn who is stable and who is emotional. And no matter how many lunches we shared or how many gifts I wrapped for her birthdays, there was always that underlying belief that I was the unstable one. The problem, the emotional weight in the room. But I had proof now, not just in my memory, but in pages and pages of truth. My diary wasn't just a record of pain. It was evidence of effort, of love, of perspective. It wasn't perfect. Neither was I. But it was real. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the one where she once painted Easter eggs at age 5, and wrote in my new notebook, My daughter carries a map someone else drew, but one day she'll want to find her way back to me, and when she does, I'll be here. Holding the compass she didn't know I kept. Arthur always managed the money. At first, it made sense. He was good with numbers, confident with investments, meticulous with details. I didn't question it. I was focused on raising Lily and Jonah, keeping the house running errands, surviving the emotional landmines of each day. But I should have questioned it. Because behind Arthur's calm, there was a fortress one I wasn't allowed to enter. And the day he claimed we were broke, I believed him. November 6, 2020, he sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Claire, the business is in trouble." I asked what that meant. He said we needed to make adjustments, cut down on spending, postpone our anniversary trip. He looked tired, worn. I felt guilty for asking. I told him I'd do whatever it took. What I didn't know then and only learned months later was that he wasn't losing money. He was hiding it. He started small, canceled the gardener, then the cleaning service, said, "It's better this way. We've gotten too comfortable." I agreed. Of course I did. Then he started forgetting to give me grocery money. "Just use the card," he'd say, but the card would decline. And when I told him, he'd sigh and say, "I told you to watch your spending." Even though he controlled every single cent. December 12, 2020, I found a late notice from the gas company. He said it was a mistake. I wanted to believe him, but my stomach turned when I saw the envelope tucked under papers on his desk. I wasn't supposed to see it. I wasn't supposed to ask. It wasn't just about money. It was about dependence. He began talking about selling the house, said we couldn't afford it anymore. I begged him to wait. That's when he dropped it. "I'm thinking we should divorce." Just like that. No build-up, no fight. A statement, not a question. And then, almost too casually, he added, "But we'll need to handle it cleanly. I'll give you something modest. Just don't make this harder than it has to be." December 13th, 2020, I asked him why now. He said, "Because we're both unhappy. This isn't working anymore. Let's not turn it into a battle." But something in his eyes told me he'd been preparing for this. That the ruin wasn't real, just rehearsed. He told the kids we were separating amicably. He told friends it was mutual. He told me privately that I shouldn't expect much, that the prenup covered most of the assets, that the accounts were dry, and that I should be grateful for what he'd offer. And for a moment, I believed it. Until I opened my diary. Until I started connecting the dots. That's when I called Mara's husband a lawyer, someone Arthur always disliked. And I asked for a name, not for a therapist, not for a mediator, for a forensic accountant. What they found? Staggering. Multiple accounts. A private investment fund I'd never heard of. Withdrawals and transfers going back years. Properties under different LLCs. Even a safe deposit box with stock certificates and cash. It wasn't that we were broke. It was that I was being strategically disempowered. January 8, 2021, he said we couldn't afford to repair the roof. But he wired $15,000 to an offshore account that week. I have the records. I have the proof. He wasn't trying to protect us from ruin. He was creating one for me. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He simply said, "You wouldn't have known what to do with that kind of money anyway." That's when I realized he never thought I'd leave. He thought I'd accept it. Just like always. Just like I had for 3 decades. But he forgot something. I had my diary now. I had me. Back in the present, I walked to the window and looked out at the garden I'd once paid someone to tend. Overgrown, wild, but honest. And I whispered to myself, "You thought I'd never look behind the curtain? But I kept the receipts, and now I keep the power." Then in my new notebook, I wrote, "He fabricated ruin. I unearthed truth. And this time, I'm the one closing the account." It was tucked inside the back of a file labeled Insurance 2008. I hadn't been looking for secrets. I was looking for the septic tank warranty. But what I found instead was a letter, cream-colored, folded, crisply sealed with no envelope. Just a name written across the front in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting. Isabel. I didn't recognize it at first. Until I remembered. A woman from the firm. The one he said was too young and too opinionated. The one who strangely always made him nervous to talk about. I thought he didn't like her. Turns out he liked her too much. January 15th, 2021. I know I shouldn't have read it. But I did. Every word. Every twist of ink that was never meant for my eyes. And now I can't unsee what I saw. The letter wasn't graphic. It wasn't salacious. That would have almost been easier. It was worse. It was intimate in the way real affairs are. Tender, familiar. Familiar in the way a long marriage should be. Except it wasn't addressed to me. You always bring me back to myself. With you, I'm not the man who has to explain everything. I'm just me. I know I should have left her by now. But guilt is sticky. You understand. That line, "left her by now," echoed in my ribs like a punch, because it meant this letter wasn't ancient. It meant Arthur hadn't just stopped loving me. He had loved someone else while lying beside me every night. I kept reading. She's fragile. Always has been. I've become her emotional caretaker more than her partner. That sentence was the part that made me set the paper down and walk out onto the porch barefoot, still holding the letter like it might burn through my skin. Because that is what he had told me. To my face. In therapy. At dinner. In the middle of arguments, when I begged him to just listen, he'd say, "I'm always taking care of your moods." Now I saw it clearly. It wasn't insight. It was a script. One he rehearsed with her before reciting to me. January 16th, 2021. I wonder how many versions of me he created. The fragile wife, the difficult woman, the overreactor. How many women believed his version before I ever got the chance to defend mine? I didn't tell anyone I found the letter. Not at first. Not even the lawyer. Because it wasn't about the legal implications. It was about the emotional gravity of it, that my marriage had always included a ghost. That the distance I felt at night wasn't in my imagination. He had shared himself elsewhere, his words, his softness, his truth. He gave her the version of him I was always begging for. And still I didn't cry. Not like I expected. I just sat on the floor of the hallway with the letter in my lap and said aloud, "So this is the truth. All of it." And for the first time I wasn't shaken. I was steady, because pain is sharpest when it's uncertain. But once it's named, once it's confirmed, it loses power. And I was done doubting myself. I burned the letter that night. Not out of rage, but as a ritual. I lit it in the sink, watching the edges curl inward like a secret swallowing itself. I didn't keep a copy, didn't take a picture, because I didn't need the words anymore. I had mine. In my new notebook I wrote, "He gave her the words I longed for, but I gave myself the closure he never intended to offer. Let her have his promises. I have the ashes and the truth." I didn't sleep the night I burned the letter. Not because I was haunted, but because something inside me had awakened. For 30 years I had been narrating my life to survive, but now I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing to speak. Not just to Arthur, not to the children, but to myself, the one who had been buried under false guilt, hollow apologies, and the silent erosion of who she used to be. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I stood in front of the mirror, fully, unfiltered. No makeup, no distraction, no rush to tend to anyone else's needs. Just me. Claire. At first I looked for what had changed. The faint lines near my eyes. The softness in my jaw. The silvery wisps threading through my hair like whispered truths. Then I looked deeper. Into the eyes that had once sparked with poetry, rebellion, and color. They were still there, just dimmed. Not gone, not extinguished. Only waiting. January 17th, 2021. Today, I met myself again. I said out loud, "I forgive you, not for failing, not for staying, but for forgetting your own name while learning to answer to his." That morning, I laid out every diary I'd ever written. 13 of them. Some leather-bound, some soft with wear. One wrapped in a rubber band, the ink almost fading. Together they told a story, not just of betrayal, but of endurance. I spent the day reading, not just scanning, but listening to myself. There were entries from the early years when I thought his silence meant thoughtfulness, when I believed his criticisms were insight, when I blamed my loneliness on my own neediness. And then there were the middle years when I started writing things like, "Maybe it's me. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe love isn't meant to feel like being known. Those lines broke me. Because I saw how cleverly he taught me to shrink. But what stood out most were the later entries. The ones where my voice started to return. Where maybe I'm broken turned into, maybe he broke something. And then, no, he did. I copied one line from each of those final year diaries into my new notebook. I want to be seen. I deserve peace. I was not the unreliable narrator of this life. My truth doesn't need permission. I am not afraid of being alone. I'm afraid of being erased. I remember everything, and now I'm ready to be remembered. I closed the notebook and finally let myself weep. Not from sadness, but from release. Because confronting the mirror wasn't just about facing what had been lost. It was about reclaiming what still lived inside me. The courage, the clarity, the woman who was always there waiting to be heard. That night, I made 3 phone calls. First to Lily. I didn't confront her. I invited her. I'd like to tell you my story, all of it, in my own words. She paused for a long moment, then said, "Okay, Mom. I think I want to hear it." Second to Jonah. He was more skeptical, guarded. "I just want you to know I said that I wasn't crazy. I wasn't unstable. I was rewritten." He didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. Then, "I believe you." And I knew we had a beginning. The third call, to my lawyer. "Let's proceed. Full discovery. I want everything on the table." Because healing doesn't mean retreat. It means revealing. And I was no longer afraid of the light. That night, I wrote in my new notebook, no longer a diary of survival, but of resurrection. I stood in front of the mirror today and saw not just a woman hurt, but a woman alive. Scarred, yes. Weathered, yes. But unbroken. Tomorrow I begin again. Not as someone's wife. Not as someone's problem. But as Claire. And she is ready. The morning of the court hearing arrived like a heavy storm looming on the horizon, thick, oppressive, and impossible to ignore. I woke early. My hands trembled as I brewed coffee, the rich aroma barely grounding me. This wasn't just another day. This was the day I would finally face the reality I had spent 30 years preparing for. 30 years of silence, confusion, and self-doubt had led me to this moment, standing in a courtroom to reclaim my voice and my life. Dressing felt surreal. The blouse I chose was simple white silk, nothing flashy. I didn't want to appear weak, but I also didn't want to appear aggressive. I needed to be myself, steady, composed, unmistakably real. As I stepped out into the crisp morning air, the world felt sharp and alive in a way I hadn't noticed in years. Each breath I took was a reminder this was my moment. Not just to tell a story, but to change its course. The courthouse was intimidating. Its grand columns and echoing halls spoke of judgment and finality. I could hear voices, murmurs of other cases, distant footsteps, all underscoring how small and vulnerable I felt. Yet somewhere deep inside, a fire burned. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something steadier, determination. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was cold and formal. The judge, an older woman with piercing eyes and an expression that demanded truth, sat silently reading documents. Arthur entered with his lawyer. His face was calm, practiced, but there was a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Unease. Fear I didn't care to analyze. My focus was on what I was about to say. When I was called to the stand, I rose slowly, the weight of every step pressing into my chest. I stood facing the judge, the lawyers, and the silent audience. The courtroom lights seemed harsh, but I didn't flinch. I opened my new notebook, the one I'd filled with 30 years of memories, evidence, and raw truth. "Your Honor," I began, voice steady but soft, for decades. I lived in a world shaped by silence and control. Today, I am here not to ask for sympathy, but to tell the truth, my truth. There was a pause long enough for me to catch my breath. I kept diaries for 30 years. Not out of vanity, but to document a reality that was denied to me. I was manipulated, gaslit, and isolated. I have brought excerpts from those diaries along with financial records and correspondence to support my case. I saw the judge's eyes narrow in interest as I handed over the documents. Then I started to recount. Not with bitterness, not with rage, but with clarity. I told the story of the subtle erosion, the small moments where his control tightened like a noose around my confidence and freedom. I described the way his kindness masked cruelty, how apologies became weapons, how silence replaced words, and how over time the woman I was had been rewritten. The lawyer for Arthur tried to interrupt, questioning my memories, suggesting my interpretations were exaggerated or emotional overreactions, but I didn't waver. I read aloud from my diary, April 4th, 1992. He told me I was making drama out of nothing, that I remembered things wrong. June 7th, 1996. He apologized with flowers, then told me I was too sensitive. January 8th, 2021. He fabricated ruin, but I unearthed the truth. Each entry was a nail in the coffin of the story Arthur had tried to control. At one point, I presented the forensic accountant's report. I described the hidden accounts and the false bankruptcy claims. I laid out how financial power had been wielded as a weapon, a way to keep me dependent and powerless. The room was silent as the judge reviewed the documents. Arthur's face was unreadable. Gone was the calm exterior I had known for years. In its place was something thinner, a man confronted not just by evidence, but by the undeniable presence of the woman he tried to erase. When I finished, I looked out at my children. Lily's eyes glistened with tears. Jonah sat rigid but attentive. For the first time, I felt the walls around me soften. The judge addressed the court with measured gravity. Ms. Wexley, the evidence you have provided paints a compelling picture of manipulation and control. The court recognizes the challenges you have faced in reclaiming your autonomy. She paused, then continued. While this hearing is not the end of the process, it marks a significant step toward justice and healing. As the court adjourned, Lily embraced me tightly. Mom, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Jonah clasped my hand. You're stronger than I thought. In that moment, the years of isolation and pain began to lift. That evening alone in my quiet home, I reflected. The courtroom was more than a place of judgment, it was a place of rebirth. I had walked in as a woman shaped by years of silence. I walked out as someone who owned her story. I opened my notebook and wrote, Today I held my truth in my hands. I spoke for the girl who was silenced, for the woman who learned to whisper before she could shout. And for the future, I am now free to write. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was the moment everything began to change. The night was cold and quiet, but inside me, something was igniting a fire I had kept smoldering for years, hidden beneath layers of fear, doubt, and silence. It was time to let it burn. I gathered the boxes in my hands, the weight of each one far heavier than the cardboard that held them. These boxes were full of fragments, fragments of a life that had been rewritten by someone else's hands. Receipts, bank statements, forged documents, phone recordings, letters that cut deep like knives, notes that twisted words into weapons. I had kept these things hidden in my closet for years, the evidence of a silent war fought behind closed doors. Now I carried them outside to the fire pit in the backyard beneath the indifferent stars. The air smelled like wood smoke and winter frost. I set the boxes down carefully one by one and arranged the papers in a small pile. Each one was a memory, painful, vivid, unforgettable. I lit the match. The flame flickered, at first uncertain, then caught the edges of the paper, curling the corners into crisp black lace. The fire hissed and crackled, devouring the pages with relentless hunger. I watched as the ashes rose, drifting upward like whispers escaping from a cage. As the fire grew, I felt a lightness, a release, a liberation I hadn't known in decades. With each flicker, the weight on my chest lifted. The years of gaslighting, control, and manipulation began to burn away, leaving me with nothing but raw truth, and that was enough. I remembered the nights spent doubting my own mind, the years of second-guessing every word I said. The moments when I felt invisible erased, replaced by the version Arthur wanted the world to see. Those memories flared up, and then dissolved into the flames. I burned his lies, I thought. I burned the silence he demanded. And I burned the fear that kept me quiet. I stood there for a long time, the fire shrinking to embers until my hands were numb from the cold. Then I gathered the ashes in my palms and let the wind carry them away, scattering them like the burdens I was finally laying down. Later inside the house, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, the warmth from the stove filling the room. The air was still thick with smoke, but I felt different, clearer, stronger, more whole. I opened my new notebook, the one that had become my refuge and my weapon, and began to write. Today I burned more than paper. I burned years of silence and shame. I burned the parts of me that were told to disappear. And from those ashes, I am rising. The next days were quiet but charged with change. I began to notice subtle shifts in myself and my children, in the way the world looked when I finally dared to open my eyes fully. Lily and Jonah were cautious but curious. They saw me reclaiming my space, my voice, and for the first time they began to ask questions, not accusations, but hesitations, hopes. One afternoon, Lily came to me, eyes soft and uncertain. "Mom, can we talk? Really talk?" I nodded. She sat down beside me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same side, not as adversaries, but as allies trying to navigate a shared history that had been tangled and misunderstood. We talked for hours, sometimes quietly, sometimes with tears. We unraveled the layers of hurt and misunderstanding that had kept us apart. I shared my diaries, my truths. She shared her pain and confusion. It wasn't easy. It wasn't neat. But it was real. Mark, too, began to open up. The guilt he carried was palpable. The weight of watching a mother struggle and feeling powerless to help. He apologized for the times he had been silent, for the moments when he had sided with Arthur, or simply turned away. We began attending family therapy sessions, the ones that had once been battlegrounds, but were slowly becoming spaces of healing. Rachel, the woman who had once tried to keep me from Sam, was part of this fragile new dynamic too. Her walls were beginning to crumble, revealing a woman wrestling with her own fears and insecurities. The tension in the room softened as we each began to see each other not as enemies, but as people trying to protect the family in our own ways. One day, as I sat in the living room with Sam building a puzzle, one of those simple, repetitive activities that ground you in the moment, Rachel came over and sat quietly beside us. She didn't say much. She just smiled gently. That small gesture was a peace offering, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the wounds were beginning to heal. We weren't healed. Not yet. But we were trying. Forgiveness, I realized, is not forgetting. It is choosing to move forward despite the pain. I thought back to the long journey that had brought me here, from being locked out of Sam's life, to reclaiming his custody, from sitting alone in grief, to sitting together as a fractured family beginning to mend. And in that reflection, I saw a fragile hope, a hope that the fiercest battles sometimes lead to the softest new beginnings. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Thank you for listening, for believing that even when families fracture, love and healing can find a way. If you've ever faced a battle that seemed impossible, I want you to know you are not alone. Your story deserves to be heard. I encourage you to share your own stories in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories of courage, truth, and healing. The fire had long since died down to glowing embers, yet inside me a storm was still raging, a tempest of relief, regret, rage, and something new, hope. I sat on the cold stone steps of my backyard, the night sky vast and silent above me. The ash from the papers drifted on the chilly breeze, vanishing into the darkness, as if the universe was swallowing my past whole. I thought about the years I had wasted, years of silence, of bending, of believing the lies Arthur told me about myself. lies I'd almost come to believe as truth. How carefully he'd crafted his story, the story that made me small and him large. The story where I was the unstable wife, the one who needed fixing. But those papers held a different story. The story I had lived. The story I was finally telling. In the quiet hours of that night, I allowed myself to grieve. Not the grief of a sudden loss, but the slow, aching grief of decades of betrayal. Grief for the woman I was before. Grief for the years of laughter stolen. Grief for the voice I silenced to survive. Tears streamed down my face, but this time they were not tears of defeat. They were tears of release. As dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, I felt a shift within me. The heaviness had lifted. I was no longer weighed down by the past. A new morning, a new resolve. The sun filtered through the curtains of my bedroom, warm and insistent. The house was still asleep, save for the quiet breathing of my children and the distant hum of the city waking. I rose and made my way to the kitchen, the small notebook from which I had read in court resting on the counter. My fingers traced the leather cover, worn but sturdy, much like the woman I was becoming. I sat and began to write again. The past is ash. But from ash, a new story grows. I choose what I carry forward, and I carry my truth. I wasn't naive. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. Healing was not linear. Forgiveness was not forgetting. But that night, sitting in the quiet kitchen, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The family tentatively steps forward. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions, conversations long avoided, uncomfortable silences, moments of awkward laughter and tentative hope. Lily reached out first. She called late one evening, voice hesitant but soft. "Mom, can we talk? Really talk?" We met at a small cafe, one tucked away from prying eyes. She arrived nervous, clutching her phone like a lifeline. I smiled and reached out, offering her the peace I so desperately craved as a mother. We spoke for hours, peeling back years of misunderstanding and hurt. She shared her confusion, her fears, how she had felt caught between two worlds, the daughter Arthur told her to trust, and the mother she always loved but didn't fully understand. I didn't know what to believe, she admitted, tears glistening. I thought Dad was protecting me. I told her about the diaries, about the manipulation, about the moments I questioned my own reality. She listened, really listened. And in that moment, I knew we had taken the first step toward mending what had been broken. Jonah was quieter, more reserved, but his gestures spoke volumes. He showed up at my door with his usual quiet strength, offering help with small tasks, fixing a leaky faucet, mowing the lawn, sharing a cup of tea. He was learning too, learning that his mother was more than the quiet woman he'd observed for so long. One evening after dinner, he said simply, "I believe you, Mom." Those words were a balm to my weary soul. The struggle for Rachel's trust. Rachel's transformation was perhaps the hardest to witness. The woman who had once kept me from Sam, who had barricaded me out of my grandson's life, was now confronting her own demons. She told me in trembling confessions during family therapy, I was scared. Losing control felt like losing who I was. I didn't know how to be anything else but the gatekeeper. Her honesty cracked the ice between us. I understood her fear, the need to protect what she loved, even if her methods were misguided. And so slowly we began rebuilding trust. Not all at once, not without setbacks, but with patience. Sam's silent journey. Sam, my grandson, was the quietest of all. He didn't speak much during the sessions, but I watched him closely. I noticed the way his eyes brightened when I smiled at him, the way he reached for my hand when he was scared, the small moments where silence gave way to connection. He was healing too, in his own time, in his own way. One afternoon, while we sat on the living room floor piecing together a puzzle, Rachel came over and sat beside us. She didn't say much. She simply smiled, a small gesture, but it carried a world of meaning. It was a peace offering, a tentative bridge. The fragility of forgiveness. We weren't healed, not yet, but we were trying. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing to move forward despite the pain. It is accepting the past but refusing to be chained by it. There were days when old wounds reopened, arguments flared, doubt crept in. But each time we came back, slowly, imperfectly, together. A reflection on the journey. As I look back on the path that brought me here, I see the threads of resilience woven through the pain. From the moment I was locked out of Sam's life, to the battle to reclaim custody, to the fragile moments of rebuilding a family, I see strength. I see hope. I see love. The fiercest battles often lead to the most fragile hopes, and those hopes are worth fighting for. An invitation to you. If you have stayed with me through this story, thank you. Thank you for listening, for believing that broken families can find new beginnings. And if you have ever faced a fight that seemed impossible, know this: you are not alone. Your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. I invite you to share your own experiences in the comments below. Together we create a space where silence is broken and truth prevails. Don't forget to subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories of courage, resilience, and healing. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope. Fragile, delicate, each step measured, each word chosen with care. Rachel was different. No longer the woman who forbade me from seeing Sam, but a woman wrestling with herself. Family therapy sessions became the battleground for honesty. We uncovered layers of fear, pain, and misunderstanding that none of us had expected. Rachel admitted her insecurities, how losing control meant losing identity. Mark shared his guilt, how he'd felt torn between two worlds. And I revealed my grief, the loneliness of being pushed away from someone I loved. Sam was the quietest in those rooms, but I watched him closely. Not just his words, but his silences. Slowly, the walls began to crumble. In therapy, Rachel began to see me not as an enemy, but as an ally. Mark started to open up about the pressure he'd felt, and I started to let go of the bitterness I'd carried. One afternoon, as Sam and I built a puzzle in the living room, Rachel came over and sat beside us. She didn't say much, just smiled gently, and that small gesture felt like a peace offering. We weren't healed, not yet, but we were trying. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing to move forward despite the pain. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From being locked out of Sam's life, to reclaiming his custody, to sitting together as a fractured family beginning to mend. I realized that sometimes the fiercest battles lead to the most fragile hopes, and that hope, however small, is worth everything. If you're still here, thank you for listening, for believing that broken families can find new beginnings. And if you've ever faced a fight that seemed impossible, I want you to know you are not alone. Your story deserves to be heard. Please share your own experiences in the comments below.